Welcome to this webinar. My name is Aude Locher, and I am the Water Resources Outreach Specialist with Lake Champlain Sea Grant, a member organization of the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network, or HazMaTON. Our network is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, the Hudson River, and St. Lawrence River regions, focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and other hazardous materials transportation. Our network is committed to the dissemination of accurate, neutral, and data-driven information through education, outreach, and relationship building in order to improve public safety, the region's economy, and environmental stewardship of our water resources. To that end, we are very pleased to bring you the third webinar of our 2023 Summer Webinar Series. These webinars have taken place monthly since May. And today's webinar is about the role of a federal on-scene coordinator and how the spill response community prepares for potential spills impacting Lake Champlain. So before we get started and I introduce our speaker, I have a few logistics to share with you. This webinar is being recorded. The recording with closed captions will be made publicly available on Minnesota Sea Grant's YouTube, Lake Champlain Sea Grant's YouTube, and on the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network's website. We invite you to submit questions, comments, and/or technical challenges at any time via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar. You can upvote questions that you are interested in having answered live. There is a thumb up icon that you can use for that. We will be collecting your questions for the question and answer session that will take place following the presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Mr. Carl Pellegrino. Carl Pellegrino is an emergency responder for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Region 2, which covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, since 1989. He is a federal on-scene coordinator, which means that he serves as the lead federal official to assess and ensure appropriate measures are taken for the protection of human health and the proper cleanup of contamination resulting from the releases of oil and other hazardous substances. Mr. Pellegrino also serves on EPA's leadership team to manage federal support to states in the assessment and mitigation of environmental consequences from natural disasters. He has been involved in many EPA response operations, such as after Hurricanes Irene in 2011, Sandy in 2012, and Maria in 2017. More recently, he was involved in the Hawaii wildfire response. Mr. Pellegrino currently serves as EPA's lead contingency planner for New York State and has organized several spill response training and exercise events in coordination with state and county agencies in New York. He's also EPA's lead planner for the US-Canada Binational Response Plan for the portion of the New York State border with Quebec and Ontario. Today, Mr. Pellegrino will explain to us in more detail his role as a federal on-scene coordinator and how the spill response community prepares for potential spills impacting Lake Champlain. So, Carl, we are very happy to have you, and the floor is now yours.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm just opening my screen here. Okay. As Aude introduced me, this is the title slide for the presentation here. Role of the OSC and how the spill response community prepares for potential spills in Lake Champlain. Just to provide an overview of what I'll be presenting, I'll talk about the National Response System, how the program developed, and specifically how it works. And that's both for planning, for spill preparedness, as well as for response. I'll talk a bit about what planning and response have taken place locally in Lake Champlain. I'll cover our spill plan, spill history, and again, some of the other planning activities, again, locally in Lake Champlain, as well as finishing up with a question and answer session. So first, starting off with the National Oil and Hazardous Substance Pollution Contingency Plan, which we refer to as the NCP, or the National Contingency Plan. It's a plan that is administered by EPA in partnership with 14 other federal agencies. The plan itself, it covers oil spills, hazardous substance spills, as well as radiological and biological releases, including both accidental releases and also releases that are a result of terrorist attacks. One thing that's unique about the NCP is the plan is actually itself codified as a regulation. So it's the implementing regulation for the oil spill response provisions under Clean Water Act, as well as for CERCLA Superfund. So just moving on here, it was developed in 1968 originally. There was a spill off the coast of France and England, the Torrey Canyon spill, which was a 37 million gallon spill resulting from a tanker breaking apart. President Lyndon Johnson had sent over a 6-person envoy from the U.S., which was comprised of the Coast Guard and the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, which was the predecessor agency to EPA. So this envoy was sent to observe and evaluate how the response was, being carried out with the understanding of getting a better understanding for how the U.S. would respond to if there was something similar that happened in U.S. waters. And what they had found was that the spill itself, in addition to the oil spill being quite a disaster, was even the response itself was similarly quite disastrous. There were no clear lines of authority. There was a lot of dysfunction and confusion between federal agencies. There really wasn't any kind of comprehensive plan or strategy to deal with the spill. Even the Royal Navy had dumped basically barrels of kerosene, on top of the crude oil spill to try to disperse it, but it wasn't very well organized. And it was this group that had developed the first National Contingency Plan in 1968, which again later became codified as a federal regulation. Over the years, the scope of the National Contingency Plan had been expanded based on various incidents and legislation that took place over the years. For one, originally it only covered oil spills. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was amended to include hazardous substance releases, which also were folded into, again, the National Contingency Plan. So now it addressed both oil spills and hazardous substance spills. There was also a spill independent of the 72 amendments. The Argo Merton spill occurred in December of 1976 off the coast of Nantucket. And there was basically no absence of scientific advice and recommendations, especially from not only the state governments, but also from academia. And one thing that was readily apparent is that there was kind of a need for the synthesization of all that scientific advice coming into the federal OSC in this case, which was the Coast Guard, and that really kind of was the inception of developing the Hazardous Materials Response Office out of NOAA and creation of the Scientific Support Coordinator cadre. This moving forward into 1980, with the passage of Superfund, the NCP was brought in to cover not only spills into water, but really any environmental media, whether it was air, groundwater, or land. Again, like I mentioned previously, the NCP is the implementing regulation of Superfund, and what it does, it carries through all of the statutory provisions of Superfund. And I guess really the most significant would be the liability provisions of CERCLA, which are pretty pretty broad and requires a spiller to carry out a cleanup. And obviously, by the term fund and Superfund, also provides a fund for the federal government to administer cleanups where a responsible party can't. So all that's folded into the NCP after the 1980 passage of Superfund. Superfund was reauthorized in 1986. Actually, the first Superfund in 1980 was, I believe, $1.6 billion. It was intended to clean up all quote-unquote Superfund sites, all hazardous substances sites in the country. And by the time that the 5-year law expired, it was readily apparent there was a lot more cleanup that was actually needed. So it was reauthorized in 1986, which I think that was $8.5 billion. Again, so it's like 5 times or 4 or 5 times as much as the original Superfund. It also included provisions for local emergency planning and community right to know. So basically, facilities that store certain thresholds of hazardous chemicals are also required to provide those inventories and even maps of the facilities where those chemicals are located to the local fire department and just the local emergency planning committee, which also was established by the Superfund amendments. Following the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989, the NCP was revised in 1993. The Exxon Valdez spill was really the first major test of the NCP of a major oil spill in the U.S. And there were actually plenty of things that needed to be enhanced. And I'll talk about this more going forward. But one of the shortcomings of the Exxon Valdez spill was that there was really kind of not much coordination between the plans of the local port, of the state, of the Coast Guard, and now I don't think there was any kind of vessel plan at all. So all those were kind of tightened into a more orchestrated and coordinated planning network, and other changes as a result of the Oil Pollution Act was to provide more clear authority on for the federal government on managing oil spill response. where the law is explicit that the federal on-scene coordinator can and in some cases shall direct resources of the responsible party, and also the state if needed. Other factors were again so prior to that spill, there was always the option for the federal government to federalize the spill, which basically take over cleanup from the responsible party. In the case of the Exxon Valdez, that really wasn't an actual option because the size of the trust fund, the Oil Spill Response Trust Fund that the OSC had access to, would have only covered the cost for maybe 2 or 3 days of the response. So in other words, the response fund was insufficient to manage a spill that size. So all those things were kind of folded into, and many more, were folded into the 1993 revisions of the National Contingency Plan, which is really the last major revision to what's been in place now for nearly 30 years. So about the national response structure, it's so national is very different than federal. Federal government, federal refers to the federal government, federal assets, federal personnel, federal plans, where national really speaks to the nation as a whole, meaning it includes the private sector, it includes local government, state government, and just all levels of government and industry are folded into the national response structure. It's also divided into regional organizations, which basically track with the federal regional structure, which I'll have a slide for later. Yep. So why federal involvement on scene? Really, I mean that first bullet about incidents exceeding or possibly being able to exceed the capability of states and local government is kind of the primary driver. And one thing to point out also is that through both Superfund and the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund for oil spills, the federal government has a significant financial backing to ensure that that a cleanup is properly carried out. Obviously, through both Clean Water Act and Superfund, a spiller is responsible for the cleanup under federal and state oversight. And those funds really kind of back up that capability. In many cases, sites that are eventually cleaned up by the federal government or even enforced by the federal government are referred to us by states because we have, because through Superfund or the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, we do have the ability to force an RP to take action. But I guess the other main point that I wanted to make about this also is not only is the role of the federal government to enforce environmental laws, to force a responsible party to do a cleanup. It really also is to augment that cleanup by providing whatever resource or capability is needed to ensure the protection of the public health. So, a cleanup, tactical cleanup, say a train derailment, say that, there's an environmental cleanup, that's one aspect of it. And of course, the federal government would ensure that cleanup gets done. But there's also the aspect of what is the impact of that spill or any spill, in the community. And that's also a major role of EPA or Coast Guard, when we discharge our responsibilities in overseeing the cleanup. It's more than just the cleanup. It's also what impacts. So it's the assessment of the impacts to the community, and obviously mitigation of those impacts also. I'm going to cover briefly these looks like 9 or 10 bullets on the key components of the national response system. I have slides for most of these, so I'm not going to read through this this list, but these are what I'll be covering before I get to how that is in place, within the Lake Champlain region. So first, federal OSCs, on-scene coordinators. Over on the left side of the screen, as you can see, the role of the FOSC is divided to Coast Guard for coastal zone, EPA for the inland zone, and kind of also for Department of Defense and Department of Energy. Those agencies also are designated the OSC for spills that occur within their facilities. Off of their facilities, again, it just falls into whether it's coastal zone or EPA's or an inland zone where the EPA provides the OSC. And in general, the demarcation of that inland coastal boundary is typically the first major roadway in, from a main water body. The main water body can be the ocean, can be a bay, can be a major river system, or the Great Lakes. In some cases, it's the shoreline. In some cases, it's the major roadway. But roughly, it's EPA land, Coast Guard water. And that's kind of the general convention. Lake Champlain itself is completely within, which is defined as the inland zone. So, for example, in New York State, the Coast Guard sector in New York is responsible for spills in the Hudson River up to the Troy locks. North of that is EPA inland zone, as well as the whole Erie Mohawk Canal system out to the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are all coastal response zone. But Lake Champlain itself is considered an inland water body, and therefore it's covered by EPA, and that means also that it's basically half in EPA Region 1, half in EPA Region 2. That's another reason why we have focused planning attention up at Lake Champlain, because it is kind of a multi-jurisdictional area, and I'll talk about that more going forward. But basically, OSCs are responsible for both in the planning mode and response mode. OSCs are responsible for planning for spills, planning for spills through the regional contingency plan or the area contingency plan, which I'll talk about more. We participate in drills and exercises as they are established, by local emergency planning committees, area committees, or by industry. And added incident, of course, it's the OSC who will be directing the federal containment, removal and disposal efforts, as well as providing any kind of technical assistance that may be needed. So in some cases, the EPA may have EPA or Coast Guard may have a more direct tactical role in the response. In some cases, we may just be providing technical assistance and resources, such as, for example, air monitoring. But EPA's role is to coordinate with the response that's taking place on scene, and being able to provide really whatever is needed, which could be it could be small or it could be large. It just depends on the nature of that particular spill. So there's also these two planning bodies that, again, going back to the Torrey Canyon spill, there really wasn't a lot of coordination between various governmental agencies. When the NCP was first developed, it created these two, so a national response team at the headquarters level, which includes those agencies you see in the bottom left of the screen. And then for each of the 10 federal regions, plus Alaska, Oceania, and the Caribbean, there are what's called regional response teams. And what those are, they're not really, tactical response teams. What they are is they're national and regional level planning and they're incident support teams. So basically, any kind of expertise or resources needed from any of those agencies that are of the member agencies, which are the same for the national response team and the regional response teams, can be made available to the OSC for whatever support may be needed. The EPA chairs the NRT, Coast Guard as the vice chair, and then on the regional level for the 13 regional response teams, EPA and Coast Guard both co-chair the RRTs. And again, the RRTs they have a kind of a preparedness mode, which is basically developing, interagency plans, guidances related to spill response planning. And during a spill, that they would be in a incident-specific mode, where they can be activated in full or partial, depending on what the specific agency resource needed may be to support a on-scene coordinator. Another key component is the National Response Center. The National Response Center is staffed by Coast Guard in Washington, D.C., and basically it's the federal government dispatch center, if you will. It was developed for providing that service for oil and chemical spill reporting. It also is a DHS, a watch office for Department of Homeland Security as well, as it's evolved over the years. But a key provision, again, is that any kind of spill, there's a notification requirement for the spiller. Again, a spiller doesn't have to determine, where geographically they are, whether it's an inland spill or a coastal zone spill. Notify the National Response Center, and the National Response Center in turn notifies the appropriate OSC agency, whether it's Coast Guard or EPA, as well as providing notice to the state and also neighboring states, depending on what the actual spill is. So the National Response Center is the trigger for the entire spill response system. The National Response System also has several national teams. EPA has some specialized special teams. Our Environmental Response Team, which is again just a national level team of response experts in various disciplines. We have a radiological emergency response team and a consequence management assistance team. Coast Guard has a national strike force, which has 3 strike teams located. One's on the East Coast in Fort Dix, New Jersey. There's the Gulf Coast team, and there's also a Pacific Coast team. Again, and the strike teams provide support to the federal OSC, so not specifically Coast Guard OSC, also EPA's OSCs. Again, the special teams aren't tied to a particular agency; they support the federal OSC. OSHA has specialized response teams, and I mentioned previously that NOAA has a scientific support coordinator cadre. Again, so NOAA has SSCs, which are stationed all around the country. Typically, they will be in many times co-located with some of the Coast Guard sectors. So there are also other teams, but those are the main special teams of the national response structure. This map just kind of shows, general assets of EPA and Coast Guard, which again, any of these teams can be called in to support a response really anywhere in the country, including EPA support from one region to another, of course, also. So how the system works. So as I mentioned, when an incident occurs, there is a notification to the National Response Center. That's an automatic trigger, again, based on the reporting thresholds of a hazardous substance or an oil spill. In many cases, a 911 dispatch may also call the National Response Center, but that triggers the National Response System here. The NRC would notify the on-scene coordinator. Again, it could be EPA or Coast Guard. If there is a spill that's kind of close to a border, they'll notify both of us. What the OSC will do is conduct just kind of an initial assessment. It may be a screening, it may be a phone screening, in coordination with the state and local response. What actions are being taken locally? Does there appear to be a federal response that's warranted? That's a question on all these spills. Also, if there's impact to natural resources, the OSC will make notification to the natural resource trustees, which are in Department of Interior and obviously NOAA, which is Department of Commerce. And so this initial assessment doesn't require a on-scene investigation. Typically, again, it's depending on what the spill is, it may warrant a field investigation, but usually it's a coordination with, again, state and local responders, and again, ensuring that there's a appropriate response to the event. If there is the need for federal assistance, the OSC would deploy, and deploy can be even to just conduct a further assessment of need and make resources available. When EPA does respond, or Coast Guard does respond, either one of us, we will join in unified command with the state and responsible party. And as I mentioned in the previous slides, the OSC can bring in any resources from the regional response team or national response team, as well as, which is more likely, any of the NCP special teams, which also are assets that become available to the on-scene coordinator to contribute to the overall response. Again, when we do respond, we will respond within a unified command organization. Typically, an incident command would likely be established for any kind of major, major public safety or environmental event. If so, EPA or Coast Guard, we would join in an existing structure, or if again we arrive very early where there's not a structure set up, EPA also would assist in basically organizing a incident command structure. EPA does have in each of the regions has several incident management teams, which can be deployed in partial or full to augment whatever is going on at the local and state level. So however the response is organized locally, the EPA will join in, to whatever extent is necessary. So funding mechanisms, I spoke a bit about this earlier. So there's two separate funds. So for oil spill liability trust fund is managed by Coast Guard. It's the fund that EPA will be able to tap into for any kind of spills inland, and of course, Coast Guard taps into that for any coastal spills. The inverse of that is that EPA manages the Superfund, the Circle fund for hazardous substance responses. So that kind of works the inverse. If we have a spill in the inland zone, EPA obviously has access through our procedures for funding the response. If there's a hazardous substance spill in the coastal zone, then Coast Guard would contact EPA for access to the Superfund. So that's just kind of who administers both of those funds. NCP preparedness. So this was also area contingency plans, which I'll talk about more going forward, were also an outcome from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And I mentioned briefly that there really hadn't been a lot of connectivity between the various spills up in the Port of Valdez. What the NCP had created was basically these area committees that plan for local areas, and there's an integration of various plans, including, so the area contingency plan would be a community response community plan that incorporates any kind of federal agency plans or state plans. It also requires for certain facilities and vessels facility response plans. So which have very specific requirements for having a robust oil spill response capability. And all these are part of in the gray, this whole vertical gray shaded area are plans of the national response structure. They're also coordinated to the left with the international joint plans, as well as the national response framework, which is the implementing plan for federally declared disasters, and in which case the NCP all the resources of the NCP kind of track over to the National Response Framework as support assets for a FEMA-funded response. So we also have a U.S.-Canada Joint Inland Plan. Again, there's also similar U.S.-Canada Atlantic, Pacific, and Great Lakes plan as well, a marine plan. But the inland plan in this area, basically, the inland plans are aligned along the Canadian provinces. So locally, there's a plan of along the border from New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine with Quebec. What the plan covers is basically movement of personnel and equipment resources across the border during a response. That's the main crux of those plans. It also discusses mutual aid between Canada and the U.S. So now moving into specifically Lake Champlain, I had pulled a spill history of, actually from our database goes back to the year 2000. It doesn't go back beyond that, and there may have been some spills prior to 2000 that might not be on here. But really, there really haven't been a lot of spill activity on Lake Champlain. And actually, that red buffer you see in that center picture, I mean, that's actually a 5-mile buffer around Lake Champlain. So most of these spills really aren't impacting the lake itself either. These are just removals or assessments that may have occurred. Again, in proximity to Lake Champlain, but not necessarily in Lake Champlain. There's one which that bottom boat, the tugboat William McAllister, that was I mean, technically that was a spill that was in Lake Champlain, although it wasn't much of a spill. It was a tugboat that had sunken, I believe, back in the 1950s. EPA, through an enforcement process, had gotten the owners of the towing company to do an assessment and recovery of oil. There were 4 tanks on the vessel, and all those turned out to be empty, and there was maybe about 200 gallons of oil that was hung up in some overhangs that were collected at the surface. But that was really the only oil spill in the last 23 years that's occurred in the lake itself. We have had a series of exercises and workshops here in the Lake Champlain area. And again, largely it started off with a spills conference we had back in September of 2010, which is prior to all the crude by rail transport that took place, a few years later. And the real impetus for EPA to be more heavily involved in spill response planning and exercises up in the Lake Champlain area is that even though it's an inland response zone area, as most of you are aware, there's a Coast Guard station in Burlington, which it's not a pollution response office, but it was really kind of the Coast Guard who was the impetus for this planning, where the Coast Guard came to EPA Region 1 and Region 2 and said, hey, look, you guys, we'd like you to we'll be happy to help with an oil spill, because we're local and we would be the first federal agency involved. But what we really want to have is a plan, again, so the pollution response element from Second Northern New England is out in Portland. EPA assets are in Boston in Region 1 and Edison in Region 2. So it really was it's really the Coast Guard provided the impetus for EPA and Coast Guard EPA 1 and 2 to develop a spill response plan. So we used that spill conference to kind of help build and define the response community. In February 2012, we had we called a spill response gap analysis. Went through some scenarios, a train derailment scenario on the New York side, as well as the oil spill from the global terminal in Burlington on the Vermont side, as kind of worst case discharges, in order to kind of talk through how a response would look. And based on that, we developed the Lake Champlain multi-agency contingency plan, which we're calling the area plan for Lake Champlain. Over the years, and I won't go through this list because I know I want to leave time for questions, of course, but we've had several training and exercise events, whether they're sponsored by EPA or the states, or in some cases, CP Rail has provided some training, and of course participates in exercises that we've held along the lake at various times. So I guess the main point of this slide really is that we've been pretty consistently engaged with the state and local response community really over the years, and it's just a matter of, it's a method of kind of keeping momentum as a multi-agency planning body. This is the most recent exercise we had held, which was a 2-day training and exercise event. So it included a command post exercise, a tabletop exercise, which you're seeing at the bottom right That was a one-day exercise. It was followed by a booming training and then a booming deployment exercise, and that took place in Port Henry. And even though it's on the New York side, of course, it also involved um, Vermont HazMat and Vermont DEC as well. Again, that was the most recent exercise that we held in up in Lake Champlain. Planning and preparedness. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay. So the diagram is one I showed earlier with these blue boxes. It again specifically for Lake Champlain. So the area that Lake Champlain's covered in, again, it's half of, part of it is EP Region 1, part of it, of course, is New York State Region 2. So what we had developed together was we're calling the multi-agency contingency plan for emergency environmental incidents in Lake Champlain. And this plan also includes, by reference, some of these geographical response plans, which I'll cover moving forward. Looking at the clock, I'm not going to spend too much time on these. The area plan, basically what it provides is a general framework for response. So it describes the national response system. It describes federal roles, which includes the role as a first federal responder of Coast Guard's sector Northern New England and the Burlington Station. It includes state and provincial roles. It talks about how environmental response, melds and merges with local public safety response, and it covers how a response be managed. Again, involving both states, New York and Vermont, and covers environmental monitoring as well. It has several appendices, air monitoring selection tables, response checklists, identifies resources, both public and private sector, and includes what we're calling geographical response plans. So I will run, and I'll talk about these more, and I know I want to leave some places, enough time for questions. I was going to cover there's three general coverages of what we call geographic response plans. In some cases, in some parts of the country, they're called geographic response strategies. But what they are these predefined strategies for oil spill response, whether it's containment, exclusion, which is basically shoreline protection, or deflection, how to bounce an oil spill, an oil slick away from an area you want to protect towards an area where you want to direct it to recover it. So they're kind of these, I guess I would call them kind of textbook strategies. They're developed kind of, on maps using visual observation. They're not based on actual spills or putting any kind of simulant in the water to see where it actually is going to travel. But what it does, so it's these strategies. It includes whatever resources and equipment are needed to deploy. Where we would deploy from, where we can stage equipment, and even stage contaminated debris. Where can we cover oil from? That's in general what these GRPs are. Going to the GRP coverages, there's three basic sets here. The first were done largely in 2016, 2017. There's 15 locations along the Vermont side, which were developed by EPA Region 1. So these are roughly in the northern part of the lake. The southernmost GRP site is at Mount Independence, which is across from Ticonderoga, New York. That's the southernmost GRP on the Vermont side, under this format, and then they, of course, go up to the Canadian border. So there's 15 locations, North Lake on the Vermont side. For on the New York side, New York State DEC had developed GRPs all along the main rail line corridors. So there's coverages that cover counties, and then within the counties, each of the counties that have railways or main rail lines, especially that transport Bakken crude, as well as other hazmat. And then within each of the counties, there are specific, more zoomed in locations, and all those are available through an online map viewer maintained by New York State DEC. What I wanted to mention for Lake Champlain, though, specifically, is there's also these site-specific strategies. So site-specific strategies, as the map on the left kind of identifies, you can see these orange diamonds that are in these black boxes. Each of those diamonds represents a site-specific strategy location, which are these one-page, again, response strategies that you see on the right side. So those are generally concentrated in more North Lake. There's not many south of Port Henry. There's a lot in Essex County and Clinton County. Not too many in Washington County, which covers South Lake is the area. I believe it's around 40 miles between Whitehall, New York, and Port Henry. And this is where there's really not a lot of access, a lot of road access. I mean, most of the access there is basically via vessel. And again, these are areas that are pretty difficult to access. But again, they identify where they're, where we can get there with vehicles. And again, vehicles specifically. Vehicles such as like vacuum trucks. I mean, once you have a spill, you have to collect it. You have to be able to remove it somehow. So these are South Lake, and they actually cover both sides of the lake, depending on wherever any of the inlets are. I want to cover just a couple other mentions on Lake Champlain planning. So this, I believe, was done over 2020, 2021 through Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Jason Scott had developed a physical description of the lake and also included a scientific support database, which includes academia from those 5 schools listed, equipment and facilities, boats, and organizations. Again, these would be scientific support that would be a resource to a federal OSC or even state and local response official also. I want to mention that. So this will be part of the next update of the area contingency plan. I also wanted to mention, again, real briefly, there's also an ongoing project, which is environmental sensitivity index mapping. And so the GRPs kind of, they cover what resources are around the lake for really for that, first day, 2, 3, 4 day response. There's strategies for protection of resources. The ESI is obviously would contribute to what resources need to be protected, but it also has a lot more sustained use in an oil spill. Environmental sensitivity index is also going to inform just not only oil spill response, but really oil spill recovery and long-term recovery. So the ongoing project being funded through the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and that's on target to be completed in December of 2025. Again, this was obviously that would also be a resource. that can be used to enhance the planning as well as again, obviously informing any kind of response decisions, especially geared towards long-term recovery. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I only have some slides of the various shoreline types that were noted during the GRP surveys. The point being that there's just quite a variety of shoreline types along Lake Champlain when you go from North Lake down to South Lake. So I will stop sharing my screen so I can take some questions, and I know I'm kind of way towards the end of that hour here. I wanted to leave more time. I didn't get to that, but I will hang out for as long as needed. So
thank you so much for a great presentation. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. So and we have a few questions that came. So the first one is from Clinton Little, and he's asking, how often are geographic response plans reviewed and updated?
I'm sorry, well, where are they found?
How often are they updated and reviewed?
Okay, so the ones that are developed in New York State, they have an actual 3-year review cycle. So those are reviewed so every 3 years, those will be reviewed and updated. The ones on the Vermont side, GRPs, they were developed in 2017. I'm not aware of any updating since then. The ones in South Lake are actually were done. They're preliminary and they're actually being updated now. So that's relative. I mean, that's relatively the answer, but the main point is that the strategy themselves aren't really going to change. There's not really going to be a need for a change. Where the update is needed mostly is contacts. So personnel that are listed, and again, like I mentioned, my last 2 slides regarding the scientific support network, as well as the ESI development. Both of those also would those are kind of seismic for having information. So I think those would inform the next changes. Once, especially the ESI development.
Okay, thank you. Question from Jerome Marty. Was there any change in regulations for rail transportation in the Lake Champlain area following the 2013 Megantic accident?
Oh, I'm sorry, the question is?
Was there any change in regulations for rail transportation in the Lake Champlain area following the 2013 Megantic accident?
There was, but unfortunately, I'm not really well versed to talk to them, to speak to those, because the rail line facility response plans are actually the regulatory responsibility under DOT of PHMSA, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Substances Transportation Administration, or Transportation Safety Administration. So there are response plans that rail companies are required to have and submit and be approved by the federal government, but unfortunately those are under DOT and not through EPA, and so I'm personally unfamiliar with what are in those plans, to tell you the truth.
Are the ESI maps publicly available?
They will be, yeah. So the ESI maps are, and if you, once that's again, the project is slated to be completed in December of 2025. So that's about 2 more years. Once it is completed, yeah, they're maintained on a portal that's maintained by NOAA. And if you were interested in looking at an ESI, if you search on NOAA ESI, I'm sure you would get to a portal which has completed ESI documents, all over the country. And there's ESI maps throughout the Northeast, throughout the Great Lakes, as well as all the parts of the country also. So once those ESIs are developed, yes, they are publicly available information.
Okay, thanks. I know it's 1 p.m. There's a couple of questions I'd like to ask. So question from Anthony: how can residents in the Lake Champlain Basin get involved in preparedness and response?
I'm not sure of a specific avenue for residents, but I would say probably the best avenue would be through the LEPCs, the local emergency planning commissions. There are LEPCs that are based on established in each of the counties in New York, through the Office of Emergency Services. And there may or may not be, I'm not sure, also what's called a CERT, Citizen Emergency Response Team. That's administered, through states under a FEMA program. So those are to be the two avenues I look at. Through the LEPCs, which are again connected through the Office of Emergency Services in each of the counties in New York State, as well as the Citizen Emergency Response Teams, which again, that's not really those aren't specifically oil and hazmat focused. Those are just, community emergency response oriented. It could be for any kind of, flooding, fire, safety, anything. Anything else, even public health.
Okay. Are you working on the next training and exercise event in the Lake Champlain region?
Right now, there isn't anything actively being planned. But as you saw from a previous slide, I mean, we have a regular presence in planning and exercising. So right now, our focus is completing those South Lake GRPs. And we have found, in general, a very willing response community amongst our state and county, local, even response partners, as well as, I should also say, CP Rail has been very, very engaged and active in any kind of participation with us in whether it's providing training or participation in exercises and workshops.
Okay, thank you. And this will be the last question. When I worked on the ESI in Canada, I found it very difficult to cover cultural features, in particular indigenous tribal dimensions. Are these important features included in the ESI, and is the Canadian portion of the lake included as well?
I don't really have that much visibility to that, but let me take a step back. So the ESI project, it's not a project per se of EPA. Well, it's not at all a project of EPA. It's a project that's being carried through by the Lake Champlain Basin program, which gets a large portion of funding from EPA. And actually, EPA's emergency response resources actually did some initial work just to kind of kick that project off before it was fully funded. But saying that, I don't have a lot of visibility to the actual development of the ESI project, but I will say that the development is it is developed in accordance with very specific guidance that's put out by NOAA. So previous, early versions of ESIs were developed by NOAA through NOAA's contractor for many, many years. And over the years, what NOAA had done is kind of created a guidance document that says, we, NOAA, don't have to use us and our contractors to develop ERIs. Any entity, organization can develop an ERI, through its own funding, its own means, and they, again, developed guidance document, a guidance document for the creation of ESIs by any I'll call it a third party organization. But I don't have specific knowledge of what is number one in the guidance, and then specifically if there's cultural resources. However, I can't imagine not, because I do recall seeing that category in there, but to what depth I really can't answer.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Carl. This will conclude our webinar.